Hello everyone. We are going to wrap up our unit on HTML by talking about various elements that you can use to create the layout of a page. So what I've got here is a really simple web page, and I've added my own colors here, and you can probably tell that I'm colorblind just by looking at the colors I chose. But here's a really common pattern for a web page. And that is to have some sort of a header or a banner at the top of the page, and this might display the company name or logo here in the top of the page. And then usually underneath that we have a navigation bar right here, and that has links to other parts of the page. And then we would have what we call the main content area. Now this is where the heart of the main content of the web page would end up, in this area, and it's usually the biggest section on a page. Oftentimes there's also a sidebar right here that might display supplemental information, or a lot of websites put advertising here in the sidebar. And then finally, there's usually a footer down at the bottom of the page, and that often has like the copyright information and terms of service and like the fine print. So this is a super common layout for designing web pages, and this is what we're going to talk about. Now in the old days, what we did is we used div elements to divide our page up into these sections. So for example, this would be a div, this would be a div. All of these sections that you see right here, we would be using div elements. We talked about that in the last lesson. Div elements, div stands for divide, and it's how you can divide a page up into sections. But when HTML5 came out, they replaced just using generic div elements with specific elements. So for example, what we would have here, instead of using a div element, we use a header element. And instead of using a div element here for the nav bar, we use a nav element now. Instead of using a div here for the main content, now we have a main element, and so on and so forth. So the purpose of these elements, now they call these semantic elements because they provide meaning to what the content is inside of them. So the search engines could come to a page, and instead of seeing a whole bunch of divs and not knowing what content is in what, now we have these semantic elements, so a search engine could come here and know that everything that's inside the main element will be the main content of the page. So we used to use all divs here for all these sections, but now we have more specific elements which are called semantic elements. Here in VS Code, let's add one more file to our HTML folder. So go ahead and right click on the HTML folder and choose new file, and let's name it layout-elements.html. Okay, and then hit enter here and put in the starter code, HTML5, like that. And since we're beginners here, we should really indent the head and the body elements to show that they are children of the HTML element. Let's update the title here and make it say layout elements. And normally we've been putting H1 elements right here at the top of the page inside the body element, but we're not going to do that right now. We're going to just focus on the layout elements. So what we usually see at the top of the page is what's called a header element. So inside the body here, add a child and make it a header element. Now don't confuse this with the head element, they're different. The head element is up here, and that's for metadata about the page. The header element is like the banner for a page. I don't know why, I wish they would have called this a banner element. That would have avoided some confusion in my mind here. But anyways, go ahead and split those two tags apart like that, and we can go ahead and we'll just make it say header like that. We would probably put that inside of an H1 element, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. All right, and usually underneath the banner or the header element, we'd find a nav bar, and it might look something like this. So we'll go ahead and add a nav element. That's how you add a nav bar, by adding a nav element. So put in your opening and closing nav tags, and usually what goes inside of this is a list that is made up of hyperlinks. We'll get into that later, but for now, just make it say navbar like that. Okay, and then what we usually have is a main content, the main content of the page, the article or whatever the main content is on the page. So let's go ahead and add a main element here. Type in main and hit enter, and then split those tags apart, and we'll just make it say main content inside of there. Okay, and we often have a sidebar that's either on the left or the right of the main content. We'll put it right here underneath the main element. So to add a sidebar, you add what's called an aside element. So type in ASIDE and hit enter, and then hit enter again to split the opening and closing tag apart. And let's just make it say sidebar like that. Okay, and then finally, at the bottom of the page, we have a footer. So go ahead and add a footer element like that. And now that usually has the copyright symbol and links to like terms of service and privacy policies and things like that, the fine print. So here we'll just make it say footer for now like that. Okay, so here is a really common pattern for designing the layout of a page. The header, the nav, the main, the aside, and the footer. Okay, now if I were to save this and open it up in the browser right now, here's what it looks like. But what we'll be doing in CSS shortly, once we get past some of the introductory CSS content, is we're going to take this page and it's going to end up looking just like this one. So we use HTML to structure the content into these sections. And then you'll find out soon once we start talking about CSS is we use CSS to make a page look good, and we call that the presentation of a page. So after we get into CSS just a little bit, we'll revisit this page that we just created together, and we'll end up making it look like this page. So it's going to have all the exact same HTML code that we've just put in there, all those elements that we just added. But once we add CSS code, it'll end up looking like this. So that's coming up pretty quickly here. Okay, so that'll do it for HTML. We're done learning new things about HTML. There's a lot more you could learn about. There's a lot of elements that we didn't cover. We just covered the most common ones, but hopefully this was enough to get you started. And we will be using HTML throughout the rest of the course, so we're not done with it.